G'day, welcome to the GitGud.CG Podcast. This is the podcast where two CG artists document their journey of getting good. Along the way, we're going to be sharing some of the things that we're doing so that you can learn and become better artists as well. My name is Jayden, and this is Kris.
Hi.
Today, we're going to be talking about learn art and not just the software. So learn the artistic principles and not just Blender or Maya.
But also, learn Blender or Maya, otherwise those artistic principles are going to mean nothing.
Yes, learn art but also buttons.
Art and buttons, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, man. So Kris, what's been going on?
Well, motivation is high, morale is low.
Is that possible?
Oh, I don't know, man. We had our 200-day lockdown anniversary the other day, so...
Oh, that's fun. Lockdown. I'm actually in lockdown for the first time. Somehow 18 months into this pandemic, and my city has never been in lockdown.
Well,
It's a proper lockdown.
They say Australia's about a couple of years behind the rest of the world. So,
I mean, yeah, it's kind of true.
Anyway, makes for a lot of good time to do some CG art.
Yeah. So what are you working on with your art at the moment?
Well, I've been actually attending a lot of lectures. I paid for this, season pass to an online school. It's not the course I was talking about, but it's just, through the Animation Collaborative. So I've been watching a lot of lectures from folks from, Disney, Pixar, places like that, doing, sort of presentational lectures about, feature animation. So there's about 2 of them a week, and they're workshops that they go for about 3 hours. And so I've been doing a lot of that, sort of taking down notes, trying to implement it into my process. Although, because I've got the animation course coming up in October, I actually have been doing a bit of texturing and surfacing stuff. There's this RenderMan competition called the Iconoclasts, and it's sort of like a collaboration between SpeedTree, Adobe, and Pixar. And it's a challenge to sort of put together a nice render using Substance, SpeedTree, and RenderMan. So, I want to be fresh going into the course, so I wanted to, I don't know, what do you reckon? There's like a statute of, I don't want to call it a statute of limitations, but an end point where if you've been focusing on the same thing really hard for a long period of time, sometimes you just really need a break from that, even if it's what you're supposed to be working on. You sort of need to flip-flop between a couple of things.
Yeah, look, this is why I reckon it's good to have maybe 2 projects going concurrently. So you have your main one, and then you have your procrastination one that you can sort of flip-flop between.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really useful. I think that's what's useful when you're at university. For anyone that's sort of gone, you've got anywhere from 1 to 4 classes at once. If you're doing 4 classes, then you're probably a bit too busy. But if you've got 2 or 3 and one of them's your main focus, it can be, I wouldn't call it nice, but it's a good way to procrastinate. The main one you're doing is oh, I've got to design, this thing. Maybe I'll do my history readings. Yeah. Actually, I don't know any person that procrastinates by doing their history readings, but
Hello, history degree over here.
Yeah, you're that weird exception. Today I am going to read about obscure things.
But they inform the present.
Yes. Yes. So how do you feel about using Substance? Do you feel like you've dirtied your soul, Mr. Anti-Adobe?
Well, A, it's just the trial. And B, how will one know one's enemy unless one knows one's enemy? Designer is both the most fantastic piece of software and the worst piece of software I've ever used. Honestly. Why? Oh, because what you can do with it's amazing. You can do a bunch of stuff that would be traditionally sort of a modeling sort of paradigm, but it's done through texturing, and it's really good at doing that, and it's really understandable with the node-based workflow. But on the other hand, it crashes every 10 minutes or so.
Cool. So it can do everything in 10-minute intervals.
Yeah, it can theoretically do a lot of stuff if you remember to save every 5 minutes. And there's no autosave, so for my little animated brain, it's just not working very well.
Yeah, I downloaded the trial for Substance a couple of years ago, Substance Designer, and I did, I don't know, it was like some natural ground texture thing, and it was pretty fun, but the sliding noders all day long is not my thing.
That's the thing. Like I've spent about 2 days working on this like really nice like subsurface material because I'm doing like a sort of Australiana scene, so it's got a lot of like Australian like plants and textures and stuff in it, and the results are really nice. Like you feel like you've accomplished something, but the actual act of doing it is like rubbing your face on a sheet of sandpaper, because it's just not artistic. It's not fun. It's just hooking up different pipes and seeing how that works, and then swapping them to see if it has the desired effect, and like figuring out what you want to do, and then sort of having to like back build it a lot more complexly than you thought you would. It's the same kind of feeling I get working with blueprints in Unreal. It's like the results when it works, it's like dopamine shoots out your ears, but like while you're doing it, it's just like, what is even happening? If your ancestors looked at what you were doing for like 8 hours like without standing up, it's just like, okay, cool.
Cool.
Is this a worthy use of your sentience?
Maybe. But like, here's the thing. There are some people that absolutely froth that. Like, this whole YouTube community is dedicated to Blender geometry nodes. And like the stuff that the end result is awesome, but working in nodes is just not awesome, at least for me. But
well,
I think it's
just code in disguise, right? It's just programming in disguise.
People that are really into programming, but also like 3D art, I think that's their thing, maybe.
Oh, totally. Like, the people who advocate for like blueprint scripting and that sort of thing the most, I find tend to be people who are coming from programming, saying, oh, this is really cool to like expose parameters and get stuff iterated quickly. But people coming from a more artistic bent to nodes are always a bit like, what is happening here? Like, what? And then people are like, oh yeah, this is a really easy way to do it. You know, yeah, exactly. It's just like John Travolta meme, you know, like, what happens here? What is next?
Yeah, look, I keep seeing on Twitter people doing geometry nodes and whatever else, and I just think like I should probably learn that at some point.
Gosh, it would be cool to have learnt that already.
Yeah, gosh, that would have been cool to learn when like everyone else was learning it, you know, if I could just FOMO into it. But I kind of just stuck out with what I was doing at the time.
Yeah.
But, you know, the benefit is now that if I had have learnt it back then,
there wouldn't be any materials.
There wouldn't have been any material. I would have been just like fumbling around for ages. And
how do you feel about that though? Like, yeah, you do benefit from the people who went before you, and at the speed this stuff happens, it's like it can be like a month before you. But like, don't you feel like you're not really forging anything? You're not really like defining a path. You're just following.
I think that's a good question. I think it depends on your priorities, really. Like if geometry nodes, for example, are something that you're really excited about, then yes, because not only can you sort of, you know, forge ways of learning, but you can, if you're sort of coming out of nowhere and you create a good tutorial on something where there's not a lot of content, like that's a really good way for you to build an audience rapidly when there's a bit of a vacuum for that specific topic.
Yeah, I suppose if that's your priority. Like,
but that's only if that's your priority. But
yeah.
For me, where it's like, I'm just trying to do stylized hand-painted game art. Like, I don't really have an immediate need for it. Like, I'll learn it at some point.
Yeah. Like, there's a lot of stuff that sits in your backlog. Like, I will eventually get to that. for me, unfortunately,
20 years later.
4 despicable years later. For me, I tend to try and scratch that itch so it's not itchy, which ends up being very distracting, because it's like I'm always just spending a couple of days on the shiny.
Well, fortunately for me, geometry nodes has never really gotten that itchy, but I did see that some people are using it as a replacement for particles, and that would be extremely beneficial for me, for someone that does grass in ArcViz quite a bit.
Is that... I suppose for grass, yeah, because it's like an instancing thing. Like, what's the Pixar one? The X-Gen?
I have no idea.
It's like a child instancing thing that Pixar released for Mail, like in 2015 or something. I don't know if they still use it. They used it on that Piper short. Do you remember the what do you even call it? The Pixar short with the little sandpiper bird where the ocean comes in, and they use Houdini to make like thousands and thousands of particles.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
It's really good. You should look it up. It's called Piper. One of the better shorts that they released recently, and it was like really pushing the RenderMan RIS shader. Anyway, moving quickly forward to your point, I can see how it would be useful in applications like that with grass, but I don't see how it replaces particles, and I think that might just be an emergence of the fact, like we've had people comment on the video actually, the particles and the fluid
comment,
simulation like, comment, and subscribe. The fluid simulation and the particle simulations in Blender just aren't quite there yet, and that's why I think people probably rely on the geometry nodes a bit more.
Yeah. Like, honestly, I don't know to what extent it will be helpful, but I'm not going to know that until I actually do. So I'll learn it at some point, but at the moment I'm trying to get good at game art.
Yeah, and having that focus is good until you need to use it. But the thing that I'm running into at the moment is that having a theoretical understanding of something is all well and good until you actually have to do it. And when you sit down to do it, you've got all these concepts in your head. Like, let's say baking, for instance. You're like, yeah, I need a high poly, I need a low poly. And then,
don't get me started at baking.
You mash them together, and then there's rays involved, and then a map pops out the other end. I'm sure it's really basic, and I'm sure every software implements it in exactly the same way.
Yeah, no. Speaking of baking, I am having an absolute nightmare of a time with my bakes. For some reason, like my ambient occlusion is fine. So just for a bit of context, I've just started using a 3D Coat Textura. And for those of you who don't know, 3D Coat Textura is like what do you call it? It's just like 3D Coat, except everything but the texturing side of it stripped out. Mm-hmm. And so 3D Coat, really awesome for working back and forth between Photoshop when you're doing your textures. But for some reason, my curvature maps are just coming out absolutely deep fried. And I, for the sake of me, can't figure out why it's not working.
It's probably because there's not enough geometry to calculate curvature.
Maybe.
That's what I'm doing at the moment. Past. Yeah. I don't know. Can't really diagnose it from a distance. But speaking of, did the color solve that we talked about stick? Because we were going to go over some stuff we've been...
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, Kris and I spent, what was it? How long do you reckon we spent? 3 hours?
3 hours troubleshooting that.
Yeah, so I've had this problem since about 2017 or 18, possibly even since 2016 on my computer, where the colors between Blender and Photoshop are different, and I couldn't figure out why. And so Kris and I were doing a screen sharing yesterday, and we spent like probably 3 hours just being like, what the hell is the problem? And then it turns out it was just one of those things where it was just a little change in a drop-down menu, and boom, 3 or 4 years worth of errors just gone.
And color space stuff is really weird to troubleshoot because everybody's looking at a different version of the thing. Because, for instance, I was looking at the screen capture of your screen on my screen of the thing that had a color space. And so I could see the difference, but I couldn't see the same difference that you were seeing.
Yeah. And so basically what the problem was, it was just like a profile, like the color profile in Photoshop. And what I've seen online, most people were saying, oh yeah, use sRGB. No, use Photo Pro, whatever it is, or use Adobe 98. And I was like flicking between, for years I've been flicking between all of these color profiles, trying to figure them out. But then there was this one color profile that I noticed yesterday that I'd never seen before, which was it was just like the name of my monitor. And I'm like, hang on, maybe the color profile that matches my monitor will fix these problems. Dude.
Yeah, look, I'm pretty sure that your monitor just has, like, I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be a feature, and I think it's supposed to run on, compressed display packages through a DisplayPort, and you've got it running on HDMI, so it doesn't automatically communicate with the graphics card. And that's why it was having so much trouble.
I've used various cables for this. So, and I've been having it for years, so I don't know what it is. I think maybe I was using multiple monitors at some point.
Color wizards out there probably screaming at us through their listening devices right now.
You're idiots!
Anyway.
No, they're not wrong.
Yes, true. I like to think I'm a fair ways over color, but when it comes to actually like setting the program for the color space you need, especially the one that you've never used, it's very difficult. That's why I love Aces. Everybody should be across the Aces workflow, because anywhere that you can set a color space and it's Aces and it just looks the same, you can tell if your monitor's off, it's fantastic.
What is an Aces?
It's like sRGB but with a wider color gamut, and it has pixel depth, which means that it's like linear but it comes with colors baked in.
Man, this is an exciting topic, isn't it?
Well, for color nerds, it's fantastic.
I like color, but I do not like color space management.
Well, like, if you figure it out, it is really helpful. If you don't figure it out, it will always come back to bite you.
Oh, yeah, and I've been kicking that can down the road for, like, what, 3 or 4 years? Being like, I'll figure it out later. I'll switch over to my laptop.
I reckon that's a good metric to say that you're progressing, though, because it means that it actually became a problem, so you couldn't kick it down the road anymore.
It became less that I can't kick it down the road anymore, and more of like, I kicked the can so hard that it bounced off.
Hit you in the head.
It bounced off a wall and hit me in the head, and I'm like, oh, there it is.
Well, the thing is also that, like, if I recall correctly, your first solution was to just change computers.
Yeah. I mean, I'd been Googling this and reading about color management for years. And I've been switching between all these color profiles, but there was just one color profile that had slipped my eye for years.
And I saw it there as soon as you opened it up, but I just assumed you'd tried it. My bad. Anyway,
I don't know.
I'm sure this is getting riveting for the listener. So
yeah, I don't know. I've got the moral of the story is I have the dumb.
I got a case of the dumbs.
Yeah, man. So should we get into the actual meat and potatoes of this podcast?
Sure. I've actually got a bit of a segue to take us from color there, actually, because one of those lectures that I have been attending via Zoom was with Noah Klokek, who is one of the lead. I don't know, is it Klokek? Anyway, he's one of the lead sort of production designers there, so he does a lot of like the color scripts and a lot of like the visual storytelling through color that a lot of the Pixar movies and Pixar shorts have. And there were some unlocks in his talk that honestly I should have come across before if I'd put a bit more time into actually learning a bit of color theory and that sort of thing. But I realized that a lot of the problems that I thought were procedural problems were actually just, planning and artistic problems. And so to bring it around to the topic today, I realized that no amount of trial and error in a piece of software was going to fix these problems, because it was a way of thinking about color and a way of pre-planning color that I wasn't going to be able to implement pretty much after the first or second step of a project. And so that's kneecapping you as you begin. And especially since I'm working on this render for the challenge, instead of something more motion based, it was really interesting because like a lot of the time I'm thinking more in terms of appeal through movement, but color becomes so much more important when you're thinking about the end result, and also just like the emotional impact of what you're doing. And so it was really good timing. And this is your topic, so I want to hear what you have to say on learning artistic principles and not just learning the software. But for me, it was sort of like a reminder that I have to get out and maybe do some plein air painting or get back to sketching, because that sort of stuff really does inform what you can then do in the software, and it makes pushing the nodes around actually have a greater context for you. It's not just like, let's invert the mask and see if that does what I want it to do. It's like you can actually conceptualize an artistic view for it and then use the tool to move towards that, instead of sort of like holding it out in front of you and seeing what bites, like a fishing rod,
Yeah. I think some people, would you say some people, they're not colorblind per se, but they're colorblind to the way color works, like how colors go together and the way you're actually meant to work with them?
Well, I definitely think some people are colorblind, because that's well documented.
Not specifically colorblind people, but just people that like, they're like, I still struggle with certain, like mixing of certain colors and how to use some colors. And I know that I've come a long way, but I think there's a lot of people that get started in CG where they're like, oh, this thing looks cool, I want to learn how to create that. And then they tappity tap all the buttons, and there's just something amiss about it. And it's because they just don't have that understanding of colors. It's like they're looking at the world colorblind, but they're not.
It's sort of using...
And I've been that person before.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, what I'd say to that is like, it's sort of the difference between the craftsman showing up with 19 different tools and the beginner showing up with a hammer, The idea being that, like, if you've got a problem, color gives you a lot of tools. And if we want to stick with color theory, I'll just put the caveat on it that this is for all artistic principles, like,
composition, shape, form, etc.
And funnily enough, to my mind, immediately came all the 12 principles of animation. So I was going to be like staging, timing, spacing.
I mean, also that I'm less of a motion dude, so
yeah. And so all of that stuff feeds in, but we'll use the color example. And it's like, people come in and they're like, tree is green, house has red roof, walls are painted white, river goes past, is blue. And that's why it looks bad, because you're doing local colors. And the reason people think in those terms, and this is coming straight from, the Noah Klokek talk, I'm just regurgitating the information at this point, if I've internalized it properly, so take it with a grain of salt. But the reason people see things that way is because they normally see it under strong daylight, which is white light. And what white light is every other color mixed together and then reflected off surfaces or absorbed into surfaces to create the image of what we see. And so everybody's internal language is based on what they see the most of, and that's daylight illuminated things. And under white light, you see more of that local color that is tree green, red roof. But in any other type of lighting, that local color is immediately overcome by the lighting and the bounce lighting and the blending of colors. And all of a sudden, tree isn't green. Tree is like a yellowy beige. Nothing about the tree changed. It's just the lighting conditions change. So you do need to start thinking more in light instead of color. And that level of abstraction takes a long time to internalize, and you're not going to do it straight away. Because I watched him do a demo, and he did a painting to the prompt of the word nostalgic, and he did it with one color and only changed the saturation. And when he was done with the little demo that he did, it looked like what it needed to look like, and it didn't look like it was missing colors. Because he understood that in this particular key drawing that he was doing, the saturation was what was important to shape that scene. Even the forms were a little off, but they read because the relationships between the colors were enough that your brain interprets it correctly. And so I think a lot of artistic principles comes down to understanding how things relate to each other in their own context, rather than thinking of how they objectively are to you.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
I think a very long-winded yes. That is. But yeah, no, I think that's definitely it. Like a lot of, before I really got into doing a lot of art when I was in school, I tried to, a picture in art class or, whatever it is I was doing. If I was to like do a picture of a tree, I'd be like, brown trunk, green top. Why doesn't it look right? Yeah, I was definitely that person where, I draw a picture of a tree in art class when I was in like, the 7th or 8th grade. And I'd be looking at it being like, it looks bad, I quit. Like how many times have you like looked at a really good sort of artist's drawing and then you compare it back to your crappy ass little like stick tree with some colors, and it's just wrong. But a lot of the time, it's just these things that most people don't really know that they need to know. And that's, for me, I didn't understand that I needed to know lighting. And that's one of the key things to make, say a tree look the way it's meant to be. Is it lit properly with the right colors and values or saturations or whatever?
Well, it's also, that does feed back into the Dunning-Kruger curve as well. You don't know what you don't know. Yeah.
And that's difficult to learn, to learn to know what you don't know. That's
and it's hard for people to tell you because they don't know what you don't know. They just know you don't know it.
Yeah, and so usually the advice is to like get good.
And then the response is normally, defensive and lashing out because it's like, it. You just don't internalize it.
Internal screaming.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it takes a really good art teacher to sort of pick up on what they don't know by just looking at their art.
Well, yeah, like if you take the art by abstract, you can pick up on the technical issues associated with the end result. But if you look at a collection of somebody's work in aggregate, that's when you start to see the thinking, and that's when you can start to fix the thinking behind the artwork. And a lot of the time, that's the thing I think needs to be adjusted with people's mindset, because even if they intellectually know what they need to physically do, if they don't do the thinking around it, thinking about those relationships between each element, and that I think that is the process of becoming a professional, is when some of that stuff becomes intrinsic and you can sort of hold it all in your head at the same time. And instead of having to break it down into little studies, you're sort of doing that on the fly in your head. And I think that's the difference. I think you've done it enough that you understand what the expected results are, and you can sort of visualize it and put it out into what you're using, whether it's a painting or whether it's Maya or whether it's Blender or Photoshop. it's the difference between anticipating the end result and using the software to see if you can get an end result.
Yeah, and that's the thing, or what we are really trying to point at with this topic today is that if you have a good grasp of the principles of art and design, it really doesn't matter that much how much technology changes, if the industry switches from this tool to this tool, because while the interfaces that you're using and the tools you're using will definitely change, the principles of the design of the art, it doesn't change.
And if you're looking for a future-proof job, humans are still going to be the best at knowing what feels right to humans. Eventually, AI will know what humans want, but humans know what feels best. And it's usually the feeling that artists are trying to capture. And that in my opinion, that's what the difference between proper, illustrative art and design is. Because design is art for a purpose, whereas art for no purpose is about how it feels.
Yeah, and so you see a lot of, say on like the Facebook page for Blender, you see a lot of beginners making art, and there's a series of issues there. Like you can see there's the technical issues of well, they don't have this setting set to the right thing, but you can also see there is some problems that they're having with say color or with light or animation, motion if it's for animation. And it's really hard to figure out, if you want to help this person and give them some feedback, it's really difficult to know where to start. Like, do you what to give them advice on? Do you go for, oh, well, here's how you solve an immediate issue by, clickety-click these buttons, or do you press, or do you go for the, how about you go watch some lectures or do some readings on, shape, form, volume.
Yeah. Look, I think resource referrals, whether you teach it yourself or sort of send them to your favorite, explanation of a particular thing, that is great for beginners because it might be stuff that they just haven't encountered enough to internalize.
Yeah,
for
I think
middle ground sort of artists, like where you and I are flapping around in the muddy middle, that becomes a little bit harder because it's like you've seen not all the resources, but you've seen a lot of this stuff, you've heard a lot of this stuff, and you've got all of your Lego bricks. You're just trying to figure out how it becomes a helicopter.
Yeah, and a lot of it is, I found when I was beginning, I was really impatient with that. It was like, I could learn all this color theory, but I just want to do stuff now. Like, did you ever, I'm not sure if you got that, but I got that a little bit.
I had kind of the opposite, if I'm honest. I am so excited that there is so much to learn that I am happy just learning it right now. And then sometimes in my beginning stages, I resented the fact I had to implement it because that's when I got impatient. I was like, I understand. Can we move on?
Yeah, we kind of have the opposite problem where I'll just want to do. I want to press the buttons. I want to make the thing. I want to make it look cool. Let's go. And then you're just happy kind of swimming around in the sort of theoretical knowledge of things that, by the time you go to do the thing, you haven't learnt the technical skills. So it's almost like, if you and I could merge into one person, we would be a functional artist.
We would be. Would you prefer Kristen or Jis?
Jis.
Galil. Anyhow, but yeah, no, I've always been pretty big picture when it comes to that sort of stuff, and I sort of see it like, and here's some of that history degree coming into play. It's like the change in railway widths between the United States and Canada. They had to actually change the bottom of the trains over the border because the actual train tracks were different widths and the trains couldn't keep going. And there was a lot of money and effort put into sort of jerry-rigging these things together so that freight could happen. And that's sort of how I feel like learning stuff in the abstract with no application is, because then you sit down to do it. You're armed with all the tools to do it, but you run into this problem that you just hadn't encountered because you've never done it before. And that becomes the thing that takes all your time. You have to focus down on that problem, how to go from one state to the other state, in this case quite literally, in order to get where you're going. And you can see the goal, you can see the piece on the other side, but actually physically getting from one idea to the other becomes the blockage. Yeah.
And I just really... I have trouble paying attention, in case you didn't know. I'm fairly sure I'm like ADD or something.
I'm aware. Me and my wife believe that we are both undiagnosed ADHD, and we do a lot of research around ADHD, and we implement some of that stuff that is apparently good for people such as that. And
do you find it helpful?
We do find it helpful, and so that's why we're on that. Actually, something that we had looked into does feed into this topic a little bit. I was listening to another podcast, and they were talking about how it helps for everybody, but specifically people on that sort of wavelength. But yeah, you need to create some form of urgency, importance, interest, or novelty around it. Otherwise, you won't do it. I think that's what I've always gotten into. The novelty is the knowledge. It's figuring it out and sort of maybe doing a small project that doesn't really go anywhere in order to prove it out. But then the urgency is gone. That pressure cooker sort of alleviates itself. And then there's nothing apart from vague future goals keeping you there doing it.
And that is where you and I are.
That's where you are, vague future goals.
Yeah, and like this might be another podcast topic, or maybe we can go into it now, but I feel like having some sort of deadline, like a pressure cooker type thing to make sure you're going ahead, is something to light a fire under your ass, because if you don't, it's so easy just to kind of wander off, be distracted or procrastinate, or
convince yourself that it's what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And so it's like you might spend hours trying to troubleshoot an issue. In my case, it's baking at the moment. Yesterday it was color management, and it's really difficult to weigh up whether or not it's worth solving a problem to fix future problems, or if it's better to get something done. Because
it's a very unique problem with CG art, though, isn't it? Because it's like an oil painter might have a brush bristle come out or something, but like the nature of the thing doesn't fundamentally change. But in CG, you might wake up one day, do the same thing you've always done, and then all of a sudden all your vertices have like moved to world zero. And it's just like, what?
Yeah. And so it's really this difficult issue that you have, where it's like you have to put time constraints on yourself, which is extremely hypocritical coming from me at the moment, where I'm working on something without time constraints. But I digress.
That's why I started this Render Man challenge, because it has a deadline. It has a little timer that ticks down, and that's like the number one thing that gets me going, is having a deadline, even if it's not what I'm supposed to be doing. It's finite, so that's like where it really fires me up. Yeah,
and so I think that like you've got to somehow figure out this balance, right, of getting stuff done so that you aren't just kind of floating through this thing, indefinitely. But then you can't just keep kicking the can down the road indefinitely. Like, you do need to solve the problem to solve future problems. But trying to figure out which category to put this problem in is extremely difficult, and it is very easy to make one decision depending on the circumstances that you are in with your time.
And it becomes a problem when the thing you're supposed to be doing is at an impasse like that. I use the example of, I was working on the FPS weapon animation set that I was trying to figure out how to implement animations in Unreal. And I always felt, I could never figure out whether I should be making and polishing the animations in Maya or figuring out blueprints in order to make them work in game. Both are important. But when you're in the blueprints, you're not animating. And I said that I was practicing animation. But the animation's not complete until you see it in the game working, so you know how to fix it if it's not blending right, you know?
Yeah, and that's another thing about CG is like you say, cool, I want to learn animation. But then there's so many like satellite topics, I don't know if satellite's the right term, but satellite topics around it that you have to learn at some point where it's like you're not technically learning animation, but if you want to be a functional animator beyond just theoretical, you have to go
learn
there.
it. Yeah. And that's what I'm really struggling with at the moment, is that I can sit down and I can animate again. I can animate, and then I can animate, and I can just keep doing that and getting better at animation. And I probably should do that. But what that also means is that I'm not implementing. And if you're not implementing, you're not doing the job. You know, you're learning the skill, but you're not doing the job. And so if you actually got into that position, you wouldn't be able to actually keep up with everybody because you'd have to learn so much. And obviously you don't have to be perfect, but when you're outside of that space, it's very hard to know where that bar is, like whether you're pushing too hard or not hard enough.
Yeah, and I think I'll always sort of talk about the power of an hour, where it's like you just do an hour of something that you're working towards, and you kind of, whatever that thing is based around, your future goals and the stuff that you're doing now. So if you're going to spend a week or 2 weeks doing Blueprint, but you want to be a good your ultimate goal is animator, then it's could be worth it to do an hour every morning of just a quick sketch animation to keep your animation skills fresh, to keep practicing and getting better at the sort of basic theoretical part of it.
Yeah, in theory, I agree. But then when it comes down to it, animation is a lot of preparation, and it's a lot of sort of like cognitive work before you start setting keys. And the problem I always run into with that is that if I get bogged down in a technical aspect of something that is part of what I'm working on, the over-under on just sitting down and figuring that out to keep rolling on the project that I've done all that implemented work up front already for seems more worthwhile in the moment than planning a whole nother animation, because that feels like a distraction. It feels like you're not finishing what you started.
Yeah, and maybe that comes down to just scheduling out time, saying this time is for this time is for that.
Time boxing is definitely something I need to get back into the habit of, because
Actually, you've just reminded me, yeah, I've completely stopped time boxing, and it is horrible.
It's the magic bullet, honestly, guys. It's the magic bullet, and you just immediately forget it's the magic bullet as soon as you stop doing it. And you get on the struggle bus and you go, why am I struggling so much? And it's like, oh, well, I'm not doing time boxing anymore. But, I mean, do I need to?
Yeah, like when I got back into it a couple of months ago, I just really wanted to get a bunch of things done in the days. And so I wrote out just like, not so much as like, down to the minute or the times of things. I just wrote out a list of the things I wanted to get done. And I had a goal of like, at least 80% of those things on that list. And instead of just sort of, whenever I felt the urge to pull out my phone and scroll Reddit, I'd be like, let's open that book and, tick something off for a little dopamine hit where I've actually done something. And that is a good way to procrastinate.
Yeah.
But
productive
here's the
procrastination.
But here's the thing. Getting into that mindset and that habit is difficult.
I think I read somewhere that you have to do something like 62 times, for 62 days before it actually starts to become a habit.
I heard it takes...
If you deviate once, then it starts again.
Yeah, I've heard it takes 3 weeks to form a habit. I don't know how true that is. I don't know. Maybe I'm just talking out my ass on that one. But I
regardless
heard it
of the
somewhere on the
time,
internet.
I think we can agree that it takes longer than we generally can do by default without thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's actually why I love having the notebook. Something that I've been finding a lot of good leverage in is having a notebook open with a pen next to where I'm working. And then whenever I have the urge to get distracted, like to flick on Twitter or something, I write that down in the notebook. I say I wanted to go to Twitter. And then I put the pen down and I go back to work. What that does is it solves the urgency of that feeling. So it's like I did something with that emotion. It reminds me that I wanted to do that, so I don't have the fear that I won't do it later because I've written it down somewhere. And then it keeps me in that focused state because it's just a quick digression. And then you just make a list of all the things that distract you as they distract you. And then if it's important, you can go back and address it later.
That's really interesting. I've never thought of that. So is that like you'll write down, armature wasn't working. It gave me the urge to go on Twitter. And then, you've had that quick diversion of like looking at something else, and then you go back to it and you can keep working. Is that what it is?
It's even less specific than that. Like, text Jayden, because I was about to like respond to your message, right? But I should be focused on what I'm doing. So I write that down. Now I'm not going to forget to do it, so I'm not thinking about it. I can safely take it out of my head. But I've also replaced texting, like actually then replying to you as the urgency. I've actually replaced the habit of that with the habit of writing it down. And so it feeds the urge without distracting you with the actual task.
And so do you have a notebook for just that, or
like I talked about on the last podcast, I have multiple notebooks going at the same time, but they're all just sort of like a bin of ideas. The more important thing is to have them within reach when I need them.
Yeah.
Because if I have like my notes notebook and my procrastination notebook, if my procrastination notebook is in the kitchen and I need to stand up to go get it to write down a procrastination,
that's kind of self-defeating, isn't it?
Yeah. So I like to take as many of those boundaries out of the way as possible.
Remove friction in your life.
You should give it a go. I find it really high leverage. It's one of those things like time boxing that I forget to do. But when I'm doing it, it's like, it's really helpful and I notice a difference.
Yeah, okay. I'll have to go pick up a notebook and give that a shot. Oh, damn it. Retail the shot.
Amazon,
curse these lockdowns.
Yeah. I don't know. Retail exists?
What is a retail?
But to circle back around to today's topic, the issue of having the motivating force and then the distraction of the software is tricky because when you're... How do I put this best? It's like, if you're trying to work on something, I guess I've asked it on the podcast before, what is the work? Like, what is progress? And it gets very linear in CG. It's like, what sort of skill do you want? And I suppose it also depends on what you're trying to do. Like, if you're trying to do renders, like you're trying to do render passes and surfaces and AOVs and all that, you do need to be more diverse. But if you want to be an animator, you have to sort of do the animation. So
here's a slight tangent.
Mm-hmm.
How the hell do people be generalists? Like, I can't imagine. Like, I look at some generalist portfolio where it's like, oh yeah, a bit of VFX, stylized game art, character art, vehicles, whatever. And it's just such a broad range that they are employable in. It's how did you spend so long getting at least employable to an employable level in all of these things?
Well, privilege does help. The other thing is also if they've learned how to learn, that's probably their leverage point at that point. They're not learning each of those disciplines. They're saying, I want to make a cool character, I want to make a cool car. but they know how to learn quickly and their brain works very well with whatever they're using to do it. They probably have a very solid understanding of like their modeling pipeline, for instance. And so whatever they need to model, they just model it. It doesn't matter what it is, they just model it that way and they make it look right. If they run into a problem, they look it up. And I think the reason both you and I probably don't have that ability, at least at the moment, is because we have a lot of anxiety around this. Like, we're both pretty high anxiety people. I reckon generalists don't have that. I think it's just, yeah, do the thing.
Every time I see someone that says, oh yeah, I want to be a generalist, and they're kind of just starting out because, I don't know, they just kind of want to do everything. A part of me is like, just wants to, what is it? In Happy Gilmore, where Adam Sandler just like shakes the child, and it's just like, don't do that. Like, I think I just like peaked my mic then. My bad. But
I get where you're coming from.
It's just like, look, if you've got what it takes to become an actual successful generalist, and it's like the thing you want to keep it, mix it up, from job to job, like, go for it. But
here's my thinking, and because it comes from advice that I've always gotten and never been able to implement, it's one thing at a time. They have the discipline to be like, to approach the thing and be like, okay, I will get good at this. I won't focus on anything else. This is my life now. And then they finish that. They can put it on a shelf and then start a new thing.
How the hell did they do that?
One thing at a time. Yeah, I've never been able to do it, but that's the advice I've received, and I'm pretty sure that that's how people manage it. And
yeah,
I don't know, if you can move towards that, maybe you'll find it higher impactful than any other method of doing it. But it does come down to personality types at the end of the day as well.
Yeah, well, we've talked about previously on our Specialized Yeah or Nah podcast. We did talk about how, and this is a very big summary of the whole podcast, is that you kind of come in, and Blender's a great place to do this, where you just learn a whole bunch of things. You learn a bit of modeling, you learn a bit of texturing, a bit of animating. It's like going into a gelato shop and tasting, 20 different things, and then eventually going, I'll have that one, please. And I think probably what generalists do is they'll come in like everyone else, taste everything. Then the successful generalists will focus in on one thing, say environment, and then they'll get to an employable state in that, and then they'll shift into characters, or if that's
personas.
Yeah, personas.
It sort of comes down to that the boomer meme, with the iceberg, where it's got the tip above the water and it says like what you see, and then underneath the water it's got the work.
Yeah,
I think it's easy to imagine sort of like what their lifestyle looks like without understanding some of the actions they've had to take to get there. And it's also like, some people start when they're like 12. If they start when they're 12, you're still in that like sponge
brain
state
absorbs everything.
Where you're actively developing your brain to work in a particular way. And if it's developed to work in this way, then all of a sudden, congratulations, you're probably able to figure it out a lot quicker than other people. But that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm more interested in coming from somewhere else and becoming that good. Something that they always spoke about in the primary school where I used to work was that they really wanted to impact the kids with this idea of a growth mindset. And it's like, by saying, I can't do that, instead of saying I can't do that, you say I can't do that yet. And it sounds really like, like a bit of a platitude. But it does affect your mindset to be able to say, I am capable of this thing.
Yeah, I think that's something I learned over time, is to, instead of just go, oh, I can't give up, I eventually learnt, if you push at it long enough, you can at least do better than what you do now. And with a bit more pushing, you can actually get to where you want to go, more or less.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's like weightlifting. You're not going to look like 1980s Arnold Schwarzenegger tomorrow. But even to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger is a full-time job, which is what I think makes it a really good analogy. It's because if you do want to be a working artist at that level, it's a full-time job.
I actually got a really good life lesson from World of Warcraft when I was a teenager.
Caveat on the podcast, we are aware of the current situation with Blizzard.
Yes. So when I was a teenager, I'd play WoW, and it was like in vanilla Burning Crusade kind of era, at least when this was happening, where I would be playing WoW, and I'd be low level, and I'd see I'd be on my warrior, and I'd see like a really cool mage, and I'd be like, oh yeah, that mage is so cool. Okay, I'm gonna be a mage, and then I go make a mage. And then I'll be like leveling my mage, and I'm getting kind of bored of it, being like, I'm sick of this grind. Yeah, I'm kind of bored. And then I see a really cool looking rogue run by, level 60 rogue or level 70 rogue. I'm like, oh, that rogue is so cool. And then, I'll go and reroll a rogue, and then the exact same thing will happen where I'll play a paladin or a priest or whatever, and just constantly changing classes because, I just kept getting to a point where I got a bit bored, a bit frustrated, and I just wanted to give up. And then I just had that little moment of inspiration to give up when I saw something that was like grass is greener on the other side, like a mage or whatever. And then I remember seeing this this other guy that I'd met earlier on in the game, and I was re-leveling back up on my like level 8 whatever. And he was, nearly level 60. I'm like, whoa, hang on. I'd be level 60 on that thing if I had have just stuck it out like that guy did. Like, if I had have just kept grinding at the thing that I wanted to do, then I would be where I want to be. I would have that end game character, but I don't have that end game character because I just kept going no too hard. Grass is greener on the other side, jumps out window, or recreates a new character in this instance. And so I think I actually remember sort of realizing that, hang on, maybe if I actually keep going at something, I can actually get to where I want to be. And I think that has helped me tremendously in getting through my architecture degree and getting through art so far.
It's interesting because I think a certain level of that exploration is necessary because you need to know what's there before you know what you like. But that has to finish at a certain point. Otherwise you get into that position like I talked about on the last pod where your taste outgrows your skill, and that's when the frustration starts to kick in.
Yeah. And so, I eventually like leveled up to max level, and I was really proud of myself when I'd done that. And I think that the realization of if I just stop re-rolling and I just kind of, not settle, but just keep at the thing that I committed to, you can actually get to where you want to go. And that took me probably 2 expansions to realize. No. Vanilla WoW and then Burning Crusade.
I don't have a metric for measuring time in WoW expansions.
Well, aren't you behind the time, hey? How dare you?
I don't know, man. I don't know. I like to think I played the long game, and now it's all Burning Crusade down to the ground.
Yeah.
But we've also sort of talked around, I think, the main point that I never stated explicitly, apart from in the title, and that's that you do need to learn art in order to learn CG, but you also need to learn CG in order to learn CG. And these realizations around focus affect, I think, the movement forward, but they don't declare what it is you're moving forward with. And so maybe to sort of scoop that up and sort of weave it into a basket, we can look at art and using a computer at an advanced level with these programs as two separate skills, right? Because somebody can use Blender to do scientific simulations or something, right? It doesn't have to be an artistic enterprise. There'll always be an artistic element because it's visual, but there's not necessarily artistic intent.
Yeah, it's just information conveyor.
Yeah. And so the idea is that if you're coming into it to use the software to see what the result is, that's different to coming in with an idea of what the result you want is and figuring out how to get there. And I think that groups them both into the same area, because you know what you want at the end and you're using knowledge of artistic principles and knowledge of software in order to get you there. And it turns them both into tools rather than into one driving the other.
Yeah. It's just that one is a constant throughout space and time. The other you'll wake up one morning and suddenly your user interface is backwards.
Yeah. Somebody in California decided that you're using it wrong.
Yeah. That there is a better way to do the thing that you just learnt how to do. And now you have to learn that thing again, or you've got to rewire your brain backwards.
And learning how to learn is going to make that a quicker process.
I think
Go ahead.
I think that is just like, it's always been a sort of, advice for life. But I think in the 21st century where things are just morphing at a constant rate, it's like, well, learn to learn or potentially get left behind.
Book by Cal Newport called Deep Work. Something that he said in that, which I think is very applicable here, is he says the people who are going to have success in the future are the people who learn to express their humanity, but also work with machines. Not to command machines, but to work with them. And that's going to be more and more important as AI takes over a lot of these job roles and that sort of thing. You have to know how the machine works, and you have to know how to get the results you want out of it.
Yeah. And I think that does give me comfort with automation, in that the technology is going to keep changing, but at the end of the day, you are always going to be the one in control of it. Like, that there will be things where something might get just automated into the ground. But what was it? I think it was in the 1950s where people were theorizing that, and it's basically off what you were saying, is that one day when all of our work is done for machines by us, humans will have nothing left to do other than art and the humanities and be engaging as creative human beings. So, you can probably also extend to that sport,
feats of trial. Like, I always remember somebody on one of the
feats of trial and expression.
Yeah, because somebody on the behind the scenes content, I think it was for Box Trolls from Leica. I always remember the words, "Don't do stop motion animation. It's the worst way to animate, and only crazy people do it. Also, do stop motion animation because it's amazing and we love it." And that's the sort of mental duopathy you have to get into, because it's it's hard, but if it's the thing you like and if it's the thing you want to create, you have to learn to enjoy the crap that comes with it. And I don't know, I just, on your point of having hope for the future in that regard, for instance, there was a stouch on Twitter in the last week where Pablo DeBarro, who's the guy who does the sculpting branch on Blender, he had to, or at least he felt he had to come out and make this big, long chain. And how the Blender community is, if somebody notable makes, puts a stick in the sand, everybody's, got to have their 2 cents involved. And he was saying that people had been coming at him because he creates tools in Blender that help his stylized workflow. And from his perspective, he was making tools that helped him and sharing them with people who he thought they would help. But then people were getting entitled about it and being like, well, what if you don't work in a stylized workflow? Obviously missing the point that they don't, like, you know, nobody owes you anything. But the point being that he had to be like, well, I do stylized art. It's not anything less than anything else. It's what I do, and it's what I focus on. It's what I like. If you like it, you can use it. If you don't, don't. And
if you really want to have more specialized sculpting tools,
figure it out yourself.
Yeah.
The point that I was making around that is that, yeah, and also stylized is going to become more important. This is where those artistic principles come in. What stylized art is, it's actually a diminutive term, in my opinion, because what it's saying is anything but realism.
Yeah.
And realism is the thing that there aren't going to be any jobs in. If you're learning, you know, 3D character sculpting, you better learn how to do stylized art, and you better have something to say, an artistic voice, because that's what's going to get you employed in the next 10 years. Something that you can do that nobody else can do, and that's what stylized is. It's taking artistic principles and creating something appealing, whereas realism is aping reality. And do you know what's better at aping reality than artists?
What?
LiDAR scanning.
Yeah.
Your job is going to be cleaning up scan data.
Yeah. People say you want to create a 3D sculpt of, I don't know, Brad Pitt. You know, in the future, they'll just scan Brad Pitt, and then, you know, you'll be like this bottom feeding, like lobsters, like these bottom feeders on the bottom of the ocean. You'll just be like this lobster that comes through and cleans up that mesh.
Well, that's a little diminutive, I think. But
yeah, I know. I was being a little bit, you know, provocative there, but
the point I'm trying to get at, though, is that it won't even be that. Like, somebody will scan Brad Pitt, sure, and that will be the expensive asset that you can buy for $30,000 or whatever you want, and it'll be an NFT, and it will destroy the rainforest or whatever. But the point is that you wouldn't even have to. You could just run an AI and say, sculpt me Brad Pitt. It would scrape Google for every image of Brad Pitt, and it will bring you a model of Brad Pitt to use.
But do you think that they will be able to, that will also have a stylized slider?
It will have a stylized slider, but that will be, like, that's the thing. It will be stylized. It won't be stylized in any particular way, or it'll be stylized in a couple of different ways. The only way that a computer, at least, like, there exists the possibility that after enough time there'll be enough of a data set that a computer could come up with something mediocratic. Like, it could come up with some okay stylized art. But all it's doing is throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks and then learning from that. Do you know who else is doing that?
Humans,
an artist. Yeah. And what we're really good at is taking into account a lot of other circumstances, and it's going to take a lot longer for computers and AI to get there than it will for them to be able to replicate a one-to-one transition between two things. So computers will be able to do stylized art, but they'll have to be told what stylized art to do, or merge concepts together to create something, or do what's effectively, you know, advanced screenings, or what do you call customer testing, where they just throw something up and see how somebody reacts to it and then modulate it based on that. At that point, you're just doing what a human does.
Yeah, but, you know, you can sort of argue that, you know, a computer can learn, like, human expression and do something that humans can relate to, but
humans won't care, though. That's the thing. As long as there are humans, if you say, look, my AI did stylized art, they'll be like, yeah, cool story, bro.
But the point I'm making is that, say, in some future, you know, utopia, whatever, where everyone kind of just, everything is automated, everyone just works towards art and, you know, feats of whatever, and that sort of thing, people would be, a lot of the people would be doing, expression of humanity in their art. And so I think that, traditional painting and drawing, it will never go away because
other people like the fact that people did it.
People like the fact that it's done by a person. Like, how many times have you seen a crappy frozen pie or whatever in the shop and it's branded as handcrafted, when realistically grandma's own handcrafted, and it's like, it's probably not handcrafted. It's probably all automated in a factory, or maybe it's like handcrafted in the fact that a finger pressed the go button on the machine. But it's just like their range of like, it's just a branding name of like handcraft.
There's just an old guy named Eric who caresses every pie as it comes across the...
Yeah. He just sits there with a newspaper and he just has his finger out on the other hand, just gently touching it. Handcrafted. Like, and people know that, and people go, usually, that's bullshit. But also people do buy into it.
Well, but also out of convenience, and that's where it's going to be for the longest time. It's going to be a convenience metric. And there will be AI artists who are like, I am using this AI to feed in a bunch of data and throw things at the wall, see what happens, see how people respond to it, and then I'm going to pull a couple of other levers and see if I can get a more pleasing result. And that's just as much art as anything else. Like, there's nothing different between that and sticking a hole in a paint can and running it over a huge canvas. Like,
loopholes.
Hashtag modern art. But the point is that it still has intentionality, and it has human intentionality. And until the AI is, for all intents and purposes, like a Battlestar Galactica like human question, where it's like, is it just a human now?
Yeah,
that's going to be important.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people will still have an appreciation for art, even when the exact same result can be replicated by an AI, but they will still appreciate it for the fact that it was done by a human.
The story is why people buy anything. Like, that's marketing 101. Like, people don't buy something because it is handcrafted. They buy something because they like the idea of it being handcrafted. Yeah,
and realistically, it's just, Craig in the factory just gently stroking each pie that comes past.
I'm pretty sure it was Eric. He's got a broom, and when the machine sort of starts to rumble, he hits it, and he's like, come on, basic.
Well, no. He's, semi-retired, and so's whoever the other guy I said. So, they do split shifts. They kind of break it up a little bit.
Very modern, yeah. I'm surprised that somebody of his age was willing to take on a contract like that, actually.
Well, you've got to...
Speaking of the utopian future, we were on universal basic income here for a while, so the future might be closer than you think.
Oh, man, UBI, bring it in. Yeah, but let's not get into politics on that. Or, maybe we can in a future podcast. But...
How about just to sort of round this out and make it a bit more tactile?
Yeah.
Give me an example of where two examples. Learn the art instead of the CG, friction that you've encountered there, and then in the inverse, learn CG instead of the art, and then friction you've encountered there.
Okay, so for learning, learning the needing to learn the art, but instead pushing at the CG, that makes up about the vast majority of my experience.
Right. So you'd say you're
I'll pick something out that's a bit more specific, in that when I was doing my CGMA class, I had done stylized stuff previously. But with this new class, I was, learning a whole heap of stuff from a pretty experienced artist. And there were things that I didn't know, such as colorizing your ambient occlusion maps, colorizing a gradient map and your curvature and all that sort of stuff. And, why you do that and how you do that. and I'd never done that before. And suddenly it just makes your art look so much better. It gives it so much more, it gives you more temperature in a way. Where say you have your ambient occlusion, you make it a bit more purpley bluey, and you make your curvature a bit warmer.
And so the unlock wasn't making the map. The unlock was the idea that a colored shadow can make.
Yeah. And so a lot of it is contrast. To make really great stylized art, there's a lot of things, but when it comes to texturing, what is really important is contrast and having a lot of hues in there. You know, like not crazy amount of, you know, hues and saturations, but enough dabbled in there to keep it interesting and keep it vibrant. And going through that and applying that into my own art, it just went up a level.
Starts as well, because you get a couple of tips like that, like, you know, colorize your AO. Or for me, it was when you're painting, throw down one of the most saturated colors you have access to as the base color, and then paint back from that, because you're never going to put that color on afterwards. You know?
Yeah.
So like you make it ridiculous and then you pull it back, rather than starting normal and then trying to make it ridiculous.
Yeah.
And stuff like that, the little tips that bring you like a real unlock, but they're not the theory behind it. And so the more of those little tips and unlocks you get, the more detailed this sort of like this figuring in. So like you're pulling the blur slider down, and suddenly you start to see concepts behind it and connections between those ideas. And that's what I think learning the art is. It's like seeing the why behind the action and why it works. And then when you have a grasp of that, that's when you start saying, well, if it works like that, then if I do it this way, I should have a similar result. But it's not the thing you were told to do. It's like you're actually starting to implement that learning.
Yeah, and that's where the AI within your brain starts taking over.
And you start anticipating the result. And I think that's really what it comes down to for me. It's like if you can't anticipate the result, then either you don't know enough about the art that you're trying to create, or you don't know enough about the software you're trying to use.
Yeah. To go for the opposite of knowing the art and needing to know the software, I would probably slightly shift that and put it into an architectural perspective, because it's where I have more of that, where I'd spent years at uni learning design, but going into a practical work experience where I was, you know, learning workflows and software that I wasn't really experienced with. There was definitely times where I just needed to put that line there. But BIM, building information modeling, is such a complicated beast that I, you know, wouldn't cry if I never have to touch it again. There are so many occasions where I was at work and it was just like, I just need to put that line going vertically across there, but I can't make it work because I don't have this technical knowledge of, you know, what buttons to click. I know how it should be because I've got the experience in doing the drawings, but this new software is just completely throwing me on my head. And it's actually a really big divide in the architectural industry where you have... Sorry?
Those who can draw?
Those who can draw, but also... So you've got this split between newer architects and older architects, where the older architects, they came up on hand drawing and AutoCAD, and AutoCAD is just like, it's just dumb lines. The lines are whatever you want them to be. You know, it's just like drawing, but the computer, basically. And then 3D BIM programs came through where, you know, in AutoCAD, if you draw a wall, it's like, you know, AutoCAD doesn't know that it's a wall. It's just lines to the program. But Revit, for example, it knows that it's a wall and it has certain rules of what you can do with that wall. And so, you know, you learn BIM at uni and then you go into work and you can sort of start using BIM, which is what I did. But then there's also that other level, the opposite end of the older generation, where they learnt hand drawing or they learnt AutoCAD, and then the industry just flipped on them really quickly, and suddenly they went from, drafting positions to more management positions, because that's just career progression, but also they didn't have the technical knowledge. And so there's this real divide in architecture where, I know this is a big tangent, but there's this real big divide in architecture where you have the older generation that are better at drawing, like in terms of knowing what the drawings should look like, because they're more experienced, but also they learnt the programs where they had to manually say, okay, this exact line is this exact thing. Whereas the opposite end in Revit, it's like a lot of it is auto-generated. And, you say, what's that line? And a lot of them be like, oh, I don't know, Revit must have put that in. And that's the fastest way to look like an idiot in architecture. Is like,
yeah, it's the difference between a craftsperson and a technician.
Yeah, that's definitely it. And so you've got this whole big divide in architecture where you've got these people in managerial positions where they just want a drawing to look like a certain way. And, in their day, it was really simple. But then, they're asking, the younger generation to do that. And it's not that they can't do that. It's just you're managing a live 3D model that can be shared with multiple people. It's not so easy to just move that line over there. And so it's creating this big friction within the industry where a lot of the older people are getting crappy with the younger people, because they're like, like at my last work, they're like, I'm sick of a half an hour exercise takes 2 days. Why is this happening? And we have to sort of really sit down and explain, okay, so that $10,000 program you just paid for? Yeah, so it doesn't work the way that you worked 20 years ago. And that half an hour exercise... But it's also probably
more compliant with actually what needs to be done.
What do you mean?
As in, it's more compliant with, Revit knows it's a wall.
Yeah.
So it knows what can be put next to and onto a wall and how thick the wall can be.
That's where it goes, Revit is too smart for its own good, where it's like, that wall can do that thing that you're telling it to do, but Revit says no, conflicting geometry, wall has been deleted.
Are you saying that the software itself is causing the problem then? Because I
a
can't tell whether you're
combination.
saying that the old guys are getting frustrated with how long it takes, but does it need to take that long? Is the software actually helping anything?
The software definitely helps. There's no doubt about it. It's just a different way of doing it, and a lot of offices they'll hire in some young people, and they'll say, cool, you can sort of figure out and manage our BIM software, right? And then they will, these younger people, they have experience in it at uni in terms of doing design, but they haven't really done super really technical stuff. And so they're being thrown in the deep end, unaware that, and the bosses are throwing them in the deep end, unaware that they are going into the deep end. They thought they were throwing them the mid waters.
Okay, so it's here is a very highly complicated thing that you weren't trained to use.
Yeah.
But I don't even know what it is. It looks like
it's I'm asking you to do something, but the thing I'm asking you to do is
3 people's job.
3 people
over 3 months.
Yeah, it's completely different to it requires a whole nother job. Some firms, especially the bigger ones, they will have a dedicated BIM manager. It's just it's someone's job to sit there and just make sure all of the programs and all the projects, are managed a certain way. That's just someone's job to sit there and do that.
To me, it sounds like the software is actually getting in the way of that.
Oh yeah, 100%. It does get in the way in a lot of ways, but then there is other ways where there's other things where it speeds it speeds processes up like exponentially.
See, the exact same thing happened to the animation industry probably about 10, 20 years prior to that. Because, I mean, it's kind of funny how all of this software starts in the entertainment field and then trickles down to other disciplines. But what happened was that all of the 2D animators had to make a decision whether or not to leave the industry, go into management, or learn 3D animation. Because for a while there, 2D just died. Obviously, it comes back in a certain form now, like TV animation and that sort of thing. But the same sort of choices were being made. And I suppose... Tell me if you agree with this, but it sounds like it's sort of like... What happened in animation was that they took the role of the animator, who was like a creative lead, who is a solid drafts person and who was a storyteller. And they sort of broke them into a bunch of different roles so that that role was less skilled and more easily replaceable. And then the software enabled that by breaking the process down into steps like modeling, rigging, texturing, rendering.
I suppose not really in architecture. In a lot of ways, it just automated a lot of it. So
it's like back in the day with the 2D animators, they were kind of three departments. There was like story, animation, and finishing, like the ink and paint.
Yeah.
And of course a bunch of like subsidiary things that needed to happen, but mainly the creative work was done there, and the story artists were normally the animators. So by breaking that down and pushing it into the software space instead of into the skill space, perhaps that's where we're seeing this this differentiation between learning the art and learning the software. Because what really
you have
stood out to me, from your story there, is that the frustration with the software from the older people who could just do it in half an hour or whatever, that's real. That's because they can, like as you say, visualize the end result.
The thing is, so can we. It's like there's been times where we just need to move a couple of lines around and it turns into a 3-day exercise. And that really frustrates the whole process of creating a building. And, that there has always been bad architects or bad designers, whatever you want to call them. But it enables them so much more because... someone
failure vision.
Yeah, someone that wouldn't have had the patience to sit down and learn how to do hand draw and drafting, can learn Revit instead, and they can kind of just generate some drawings.
But that's the way a lot of things go, isn't it? The more democratized the skill becomes, the more democratized. The more noise you get at the lower levels.
Yeah, definitely. It's more democratized, which is definitely good and bad. But I think, this is really starting to tangent now, but I think that a lot of the issues in architecture, and therefore what manifests itself in the cities, can be laid at the feet of Autodesk. Because Revit, it is barely updated since I started using it. I started using it in like 2011.
But that's the Autodesk model. They buy up all the competition and then they choose one that they want to be the thing and then starve the rest.
Yeah, and last year I think I said something, I was talking about that on Twitter, and then someone chimed in being like, "Oh, what do you mean? Revit has like Zoom integration. How is that not 2021 or whatever?" And I'm like, I think this person has sort of missed the point of what I was talking about. That's nice, but there's no, it's not a leap from box modeling to geometry nodes. There's no innovation. It's like, cool, that's a nice bell and that's a nice whistle that you can put in, but there's no innovation. It's kind of like they've got it, and now they're just sitting on it, and they're just doing enough updates to stop people from taking them to the gallows.
I'm going to play devil's advocate there for a moment because
Yeah.
I do have a little bit of knowledge of how software development goes in that regard. If you have such a high user base as Autodesk does, changing anything is political.
Yeah.
Like, if it's working for people, they do not want it to change. And this actually does fold it back into the topic. It's like, it could change tomorrow, and that will slow you down, because now you have to relearn the interface. You need to relearn a way of doing things. Geometry nodes, you haven't learned that, because there's a barrier, right? But the reason people learn it is because it's kind of fun, and it gets a good result. There's less of a incentive in architecture to do that, because nobody's sitting there on the week. Well, nobody, asterisk, is sitting there on the weekend going, you know what I'm really going to do after this long week of doing architecture in Revit? I'm going to go home, sit down at the coffee table with my laptop, pop a beer, and do some more architecture in Revit.
Yeah. I will say that what has really stunted Autodesk's development or Revit's development is that they have been obsessively trying to spread it out more. So it's gone from, just architects to they're trying to bring structural engineers, mechanical engineers, hydraulic engineers, electrical engineers, and manufacturers.
Point, right?
So what they've been doing is architecture for Revit got to a certain point and it just like dramatically slowed, and now they're trying to pull everyone in. But
they want one drafting software, and at the moment they've got AutoCAD, they've got CATIA, they've got Revit, and they've got whatever that other one is. Solid. Do they have SolidWorks?
Yeah, I mean, not really use Revit. At least Revit and ArchiCAD are the big ones. But
my point being is that they've got this suite of tools. If they can make them feature parallel, they'll pick one, and then they'll move everybody they can over time onto that one. It's why they haven't killed 3ds Max yet, because they're trying to get everybody off 3ds Max onto Maya, so that when they do kill Max, it's just for old people who complain.
But the point I do want to make is that it's not like there isn't a demand for this. It's you go to any office and you ask them, what's your frustration with Revit? You will get a long rant. And there is actually, I think it was maybe last year or the year before, I think it was probably about 100, I think it was 100, I could be wrong on that, but there was about 100 of the leading architects in the world, and they wrote an open letter to Autodesk about Revit, basically saying, get your shit together. We're paying, I don't know what, like $5,000, $10,000 for a program that we are barely getting any new features from. Like, this program is actually starting to get in the way, because it's like using something from 2002, and it looks like that and it feels like that. And so there is this clear market demand for people to want to do that. But yeah, it's just Autodesk kind of sitting there and going, okay, well, we want more people to use our product. And so we've got the architects. Now let's pull the engineers in. Let's pull the fabricators in. And
they'll give you just enough to keep the architects while they're doing that.
Yeah.
The point is that, okay, that's a gap in the market. But I can't help but make this a little bit political in a global sense, because that's what it is. Because it's a gap in the market ready for exploitation by somebody who wants to be an industry disruptor. But do you know what the industry disruptor has to do in order to do that?
What?
They have to gain capital, which means that they go and they get funded, which means that now they have capital interests and they have a board of directors.
Yeah.
They'll come up with, the bee's knees of architectural software. It'll develop for 5-6 years and everybody will love it. It'll be an amazing product. Everybody will stop using Revit and it will disrupt the entire industry. Then the board of directors will want their money back, so they'll sell it to Autodesk.
Potentially, but there are things that people are...
or Adobe, if they swoop in quick enough.
There are...
Because they want 3D, man. They want their greasy fingers all over 3D.
There are things that are outside of Revit that. Like, and by the way, I'm not completely shitting on Revit. There are things where I'm like, when I go from using just AutoCAD 2D and I switch back over to Revit, I'm like, oh man, this is like a breath of fresh air in terms of things that you can really save you time on. But, yeah, I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, in that case, I'll tangent us back in a different direction
okay.
while you're thinking about it. It's interesting with software as a obstacle because I prefer working on the artistic side of things, but I also sometimes get into moods where I couldn't care less about the artistic side of things, and the technical side of things really fascinates me. They don't tend to line up with what I'm supposed to be doing, but I definitely get into the two moods. And what really is interesting about how software works and how it's sort of sold and how the industry utilizes it is that anything new has to be old before it's used, but if it's going to be old, it has to be used. And so there's this catch-22. And when I was starting out, I really looked forward to any like new software that was brought out and like had a new approach on the same thing and like interpreted the same thing in a different way that was maybe like closer to the way that you would naturally think about it. But what always happens is that they come up with some crazy UI that technically works well because they've thought about it. Like they're doing a really good job of thinking about it and implementing it and having problems. But because it's not industry standard, as soon as anybody tries to use it, they feel slowed down and it doesn't feel good. And the workflow is different and they can't just bounce between the two because then all the hotkeys don't work.
And then there's the lack of documentation or like
lack of documentation
resources.
Is a big one.
And like you've got things like Armor Paint. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
And Armor Paint, like it looks, I haven't used it, but you know, it looks pretty cool. But
it's got
also
the exact same problem that Blender has, which is that it's got most of the highlight features that you need for one of those softwares. But when you get down to it, like even for the other problem that we thought your color management thing was, in Blender, sometimes the sRGB workflow doesn't work right if it's in 8-bit and you throw it to Photoshop, right? And that's just little things that at a company like Autodesk, let's not go saying they will fix, but they have the resources to fix if it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
And so with software like Armor Paint, there's going to be so many of those like little niggly things that unless you're like a Python god, you cannot fix, and therefore it's unusable.
Yeah, and I've noticed that with 3D Coat, actually. It's a pretty good software, but there's just little niggly things where it's like, come on. Like, can you just do the thing?
If you're using it for a small enough part of your pipeline,
it's fine.
Or if you are taking on learning that software as a hobby, like you animate in Maya all day and you want to look at something a little bit different when you come home, but you still want to work on your short film or your game or whatever, you jump into like Blender or Akitsu or something, and that's your hobby, right? Because then the problems become something to learn about and overcome, and that's the hobby, because you're not trying to output. But as soon as it becomes important to actually have things work like a clockwork mechanism, which they never do, but the lower the friction, the better. And with something like, I don't know, like Akitsu is the one that I mentioned. It has all of these really cool ways of doing stuff. Like, I don't think I want to rig in any other software, and I really hope that Akitsu rigging catches on, because that's really good. But the way it works doesn't work in tandem with anything else. And so unless you can output it to an FBX or import it through an FBX, it's this little island of software that you then have to figure out a workflow around it rather than through it.
Yeah, and I think that's the barrier that pretty much every new software hits. And I think that the ones that really are able to, come up and sustained, they're the new software. It's like when they are doing something new, and not something new as in like a kind of gimmicky sort of way, but new, like
Actually, a different approach. To
actually
the
a
same thing.
different approach. So take Marmoset, for example. There were things like what was it, X normals or whatever, but Marmoset was such a leap forwards because it was doing something. It was approaching that problem, but in a very different way. And, it's similar with Substance Painter when they were just sort of, small boys.
Yeah. And that's the difference, right? That's the difference between something actually problematic and something suffering from tech debt. Because, for instance, I still use XNormal. Because A, it's free. B, it always works. And C, I tried to figure out baking in Substance Painter and I was ready to throw my computer out the window.
Really? I didn't really have much of an issue with it from memory.
Well, baking low poly, like baking the mesh maps, not actually baking to the... Never mind. The point is that it's a different workflow. Marmoset, I could just go in there and I could just figure it out easily and it just worked. Quixel, when it was in the Photoshop implementation, was the same. Substance Painter just does it differently, and that bothers me.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, but I still use XNormal, and I would go to Marmoset next if I was going to get a texturing software, because I like the way that they've implemented their texturing tools. And I hate Adobe, so it's like a win-win.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited for Marmoset. I've got Marmoset 3.
Yeah.
I'm really keen to sort of see what happens
How
with
it develops.
number 4. Yeah.
It's very exciting to me because it's sort of like a middle ground between Mixer and Substance, and it sort of does think it's sort of like, how in Venn diagrams you can have two separate globes that don't overlap, but then one in the middle that overlaps both.
Yeah.
But then there's also space in the middle that doesn't intersect any.
Yeah.
That's kind of where Marmoset sits for me, and I feel like the other two approaches don't really solve the problem, and I think Marmoset kind of does.
Yeah, and something I really love about Marmoset is that it is so good at baking. Like, I'm not a baking god, not to say that, baking requires a huge amount of skill, but it's always usually the most pain-free way that I can bake something. And
Well, that's the thing. The only reason I use XNormal is because it's pain-free. Like, I don't actually like the results that much, and I do have to do some, like, post-touching work to it because it's just an old algorithm.
yeah,
Like, if somebody said, hey, would you like to use Marmoset instead? I'll pay for it. I'd be like, yes, immediately.
yeah.
Or like something like Nald. Do you know Nald? Knald?
I've heard of it. I looked it up when I was thinking of buying Marmoset last year, I think it was.
It's kind of like all it does is baking. Like, it doesn't do anything else. And I love programs like that where it's just like, here's the thing, it does this thing, and it does it well.
What is my purpose?
Yeah.
Past
But
the
it's
whatever.
way too expensive for just what XNormal does, So
Yeah.
if I was going to upgrade to something paid, I'd probably trial the Marmoset 4 software and then sort of see if I wanted to buy a permanent license, which you can. I love permanent licenses.
Oh, yes, I've got a permanent license for Marmoset 3, and I love it knowing that I have it. It's done.
And you don't have
I've
that
got
stress like I'm paying for something I'm not using, but I can't get rid of it because I might need it.
Yeah, me on my texture subscription for Polygon, I am constantly, every time I think about Polygon, I think I should probably cancel that, but I might need it soon.
And they're making money off your laziness because that you could probably go a few months without using some of these things and you could quit the subscription and then go through the process of resubscribing.
Yeah.
And then you'd save a bit of money. But nobody does that. Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah, actually, Andrew Price put out a tweet recently about something to do with him forgetting to cancel a subscription for something. I can't remember what it was. I think it might have been PayPal.
Wistia.
Yeah, I don't remember. He put out a tweet about that, and again, I just thought, oh yeah, good point. I should probably cancel my Polygon subscription.
That's funny. Yeah. I don't know. It's funny in this world where you have such easy access to the people who run the things you use because it's it does become a little personal.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So should we start to wrap this podcast up? We're getting a bit rambly.
Sure. Do you think we've answered the question?
In a very long-winded way.
Well, it's a very long-winded podcast. So
Oh, definitely. But an enjoyable one nonetheless.
I'm sure that we've all learned some things along the way.
Yeah. So
the real friends, Jayden, are the software we used along the way.
yeah. So Kris, what are your socials?
You can follow me at AnimatorChris anywhere on the internet. Probably one more week on the Y-Axis newsletter. If I don't hit critical mass by probably the next time the podcast uploads, I'm probably going to shelve it for now and move on to other things. So give me a message if you're interested in that. There's a little bit of a blurb telling you a bit more about it on the landing page. So head on over there if you're interested in that.
All right. And you can find me at Twitter on JSTO_art. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe. See ya.
Bye. Something weird about Melbourne, everybody here has really loud cars. And, like, they really shouldn't. Like, they've got, what do you call, like, Nissan sedan or something, and it's got, like, a split exhaust on it. So it's, like, just, like, taking Susie to daycare, and it's like, wah, wah.
Have a lovely day, daycare. Say hello to Mrs. Caterpillar for me.
I'm gonna go hang out at the shopping centre with no mask on.
Anyway, I'll get into the intro.
Okay.
Let me just we'll have a couple of attempts.
My body is ready.
Not again. Not again.
Not like this.
Not like this.